adversaries' civilian infrastructure. I don't think that's really in the Danish spirit, right? You would violate international law. You would have huge problems in combating cybercrime, right? It's like, how do you even prosecute cybercrimes after this, right? If you endorse this, it's like, what do you do? And so I think our silence currently is laying the ground for a lot of problems that will appear in the future. Primarily if other adversaries out there, if China replicates this, if this is used in Taiwan to defend themselves, if other conflicts, for example, social causes pick this up. If you think about fighting climate change, if they move online and replicate what the IT Army does, it's like, Jesus, if you're against climate change, it would be DDoS. It's like relentlessly. And I think a lot of people here, I didn't explain this maybe fully, but the IT Army doesn't DDoS you just for an hour or two. The IT Army is really relentless. They will DDoS you for days, weeks, and months. So you will have numerous problems. Like you have to really geofence yourself, or just take the site offline and just be like, well, we're not having any service anymore. And what the IT Army does is not only it essentially targets everything that's in the .ru domain. So, for example, they're very specific and very targeted about this. So when there's tax season in Russia, they will target the tax service, right? Nobody can pay their taxes. When students want to enroll for university courses, they will target university websites, so no students can enroll, right? They will target freelance platforms, like similar to Fiverr, where they're essentially saying, like, yeah, Russian freelancers essentially are disseminating disinformation. That's why we hit them, right? They will target car sales shops. They're essentially saying, like, yeah, Russians use their cars to travel to the front lines. They will always find an excuse to militarize this in some way, but it's really weird because they target everything. And the broad overview of how they target is that during weekdays, they target businesses and governments, and government sites and services, and on weekends, they target everything that's related to entertainment. So if you, as a Russian, sit in Moscow, you want to order food delivery, they will target food delivery service. They will target cinemas, so you cannot buy tickets online. So it's very targeted, and the purpose behind this is that they want ordinary Russians to feel that the war is going on, that the ordinary Russian will pay a price. When they go to the ATM, it doesn't work because the bank has been DDoSed. They want to feel that small little tricks that make the Russians think that the war is going on and there are consequences to this. And even if Kiev falls, even if Ukraine is fully occupied, this thing, the RT Army, will continue. Because it's made up of volunteers, it's online, right? So they're relentless in this. And somebody will replicate this, and the IT Army will evolve from this, right? So there will be other stuff that they will come up with.
What is the, I guess, responsibility of those international companies whose technology this is based on? You told me, for example, that they're using the Clearview AI facial recognition technology. Could you speak to that? And then I guess I would like to know about this. What stands to those companies taking, and what is the responsibility?
All right, Clearview is an interesting case. I don't know if everybody knows Clearview. Clearview is essentially a facial recognition application or software that essentially scraped the entire internet. So they have a massive data set of everybody in the world, essentially. All social media, they essentially scrape everything, right? And so they're a US headquartered company. But they sell into, for example, to EU countries, right? They sell to law enforcement and so on. And of course, this violates GDPR, right? No brainer, right? So they face massive lawsuits all over the world. In the United States, the ACLU brought a lawsuit essentially for violating everything privacy, essentially. There's no privacy when Clearview is involved. Essentially, the New York Times released a report, released an article that essentially said Clearview is the end of privacy as we know it. Right? So literally, if you can use the app, you just go in the street, you just use it and take a picture of somebody, you essentially know everything about them. Like what is their social media profile, where they're working, what's their name, their address, other kind of pictures, events they have attended, like how they relate to other people, with their friends and families and so on. So it's essentially, it's a total blast. Like, there's no privacy in it, right? So what Clearview did, after being essentially pushed out of all these markets and being fined millions of dollars and pounds and euros, is they offered their service to the Ukrainian government. And the Ukrainian government gratefully accepted. They're like, we can use this. And so how does the Ukrainian government use this? So essentially, Fedorov came out, the Minister of Digital Transformation, said openly a few weeks ago that around 14 to 15 government ministries in Ukraine are using Clearview on a daily basis. So think, for example, border controls. Everybody who comes into Ukraine essentially gets checked with Clivview. Did you say anything pro-Russian on social media? They will figure this out, right? It's kind of weird, but that's essentially what's happening. And one of the major things, that's what we know, the IT Army posted about it, because the IT Army explained to us how it's being used by essentially the security service and also the cybercrime police, is that essentially Clivview is used to identify dead Russian soldiers. So the corpses that are lying on the streets and so on in the woods, to identify them. And what they do, essentially what the Ministry of Interior told, that's the official rhetoric, is that they will essentially figure out who this dead Russian soldier is, go on social media and inform the relatives that their son or husband or daughter has died. Because the Russian government won't tell them, right? So it was framed even in media as a kind of humanitarian effort, right? You inform the Ukrainian population of the loss, you give them closure. But what actually happens, and that's what the IT Army exposed in that sense, is that they will go on social media, they will essentially, they will use not any account that you would reference to Ukraine, so like it will be Peter125. They will message the relative, they will essentially send them a picture of the dead husband or wife or soldier or son, blood flowing, like the face is mangled, might be having no legs and so on. They will also give them pictures on identifying items that they have on them, like a picture of the loved one or whatever, a trinket. And essentially the message is, that's what I've seen, is that they will write, this is the price that your family pays for coming to Ukraine and fighting. We know who you are, we know where you live, we will not forget. And so this is a very different kind of approach, right? This has nothing to do anything with humanitarian efforts anymore. This is information warfare, this is psychological warfare. This is literally driving a wedge between Ukrainian and Russian people. And so the question here is, of course, if this would happen to Danish soldiers, what would we do? We know this happened to US soldiers when they were deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, going against Islamic State. Primarily Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria, where the Islamic State essentially sent emails to, or social media DMs to the family of soldiers deployed in Iraq and Syria, and told them, we know who you are, we know what your husband does, and so on. And as a consequence, the guy who organized this on the Islamic State side essentially was taken out with a drone strike while he was in Raqqa, fueling up his car at a petrol station. So that's the consequence if you do this to a US soldier. But I mean, apparently it's fine if Clivview, if the US company is involved in that stuff and kind of facilitates that, nobody's batting an eye. And so from a Russian perspective, this is kind of Western hypocrisy, right? You're all about international law and norms and being like the good citizens, but essentially your companies are out there supporting this kind of work. And so there's a lot of Russian anger about this. And we're not even talking about it, right? We're not even having a conversation. Many of us don't even know about the stuff that's going on. But that's essentially then the conversation that happens everywhere else. And I think we need to engage in that conversation. We need to have, is that right for Clivview to do these operations as well, and to contribute to that, or should they pull out? And or are these companies that essentially have found a segment like Palantir has? I think Palantir went through that same kind of being hated by Western society, being vilified as this bad kind of company that does evil things, like supporting law enforcement and the racist agenda and so on, and all these articles. And Palantir is super popular in Ukraine, right? And the whole visibility of what these companies are doing has now a positive vibe. I think everybody, I don't know, you probably remember when people at Google were protesting about Project Maven, right? Essentially Google doing this work for the US, for the Pentagon. And people went out of the street and said, we don't want to work on military stuff, we're against it. But with the Ukraine war, everything essentially changed. Across the world, in Europe, in the United States, there's a different attitude about it, because people realize these applications, they serve a purpose. You can use them for good. You can use them to win a war. You can use them to defeat your adversary. But there's also a negative side of this, and I think we need to talk about this. Not in the style of Maven and protesting, but really like finding our inner selves and being like, is this the right thing to do? Where do we stand? What are our norms and our interpretations on this?
I guess a little bit going back to what's the problem. I feel like is it that unusual that you have tools that you can use for good and tools that you can use for bad, and some use cases you'll accept and some you won't? I don't feel like, is that unique to these IT tools?
I think it's not unique to these IT tools, but what these software products has enabled is that civilians get essentially to decide what's going to be out there. Civilians will essentially come together, volunteers, they will find their own groups and create essentially software, some through the demand of what the ministries and the armed forces are looking for, but also individually. They will come out and just do stuff that the army never thought about. Like there are numerous groups in Ukraine that have essentially formed after the Maidan protests and after the war in Donbass essentially happened in 2014. That essentially they were essentially civilians. Some of them had military experience, and probably the most prominent group is Aerorozvidka, which means aero reconnaissance. So Aerorozvidka is essentially, there were 4 guys that came together. They were deployed in Donbass, they fight at the front lines, and they realized the Ukrainian army is not technologically equipped to fight this war. There's no situational awareness, there's no processing of data. They're really like, they were fighting like in the Stone Age. And so what Aerorozvidka did was they created essentially the first Ukrainian drone operation. There's essentially 12 drones. They tinkered together, they bought them, it cost them a lot of money. They had to find experts that essentially repair drones and stuff like that and modify them. And once they deployed them on the front lines, essentially what happened is that they lost all 12 drones to electronic warfare measures the Russians essentially used in the Donbass. So there was a harsh reckoning of what was happening, and that they themselves were not equipped for that. So they veered essentially to stationary cameras, because in the Donbass area, I think you've seen that in Mariupol, when the fight for Mariupol was on, it's like Azovstal and so on, it's huge, massive steel complexes where you have this fighting that's going on. And what they did was deploy standing cameras. They attached them to satellite terminals. At that time, it was still a Ukrainian operator, very low bandwidth, super expensive. Later on, they transitioned to use Starlink for that stuff. But they essentially became the more innovative, the most innovative unit in Ukraine. And later on, they became military. They became a part of the Ukrainian military, and they became the IT hub essentially for the armed forces. And what they were essentially able to do was, and Nathan Kazim talks about this in a very nice article. He literally went to IBM in Ukraine and said, like, who has received a military issue that he has to serve on the front line? It's like, and people hands went up. It's like, what are you doing? I'm a systems engineer. I developed this kind of software and so forth. And he was like, you're not being digging trenches. We need people like you. You'll come work for us. And so a lot of people whose skills were never really acknowledged should be armed forces, which is waste in the front lines to just fight there. They had a place to go where they can essentially apply their skills and push the army to become more technologically adept. And so there are numerous projects that are going on that Aerorozvidka has essentially spurred. One of them is Delta, which is built on NATO standards, which is a situational awareness platform, which is this digital map. It looks like Google Maps, but essentially all the incoming reports through the enemy and other apps from civilians, from military frontline troops and so on, go into this application, into this map. And so people, even in the field, they can access it because it's a cloud-based platform. They can access it online, so that's why you see troops in the field with installing terminals and with small laptops, rock laptops, sitting down and like logging in online and checking these maps to see what's happening in the vicinity, who's there, what kind of information we have. And this is like instantaneous, right? So they're really efficient, and Delta is pretty much the platform that now unifies everything, where even like people who develop like apps for like PDAs for soldiers, they can check the location and so on. Like that information is also integrated in Delta. So Delta is spreading essentially its wings and becomes the central application for everything. But again, the people that Delta essentially hired, they all come from the private sector. They're not, like the military they don't have any people to actually educate, to offer courses that would teach people on IT stuff. It's like everybody from the private sector is flowing into the armed forces. And so this is the militarization that is happening. And some of this is really good. Some of this makes Ukraine super efficient. That's why they're able to hold the Russians back. The Russians just throw mass at them. And the Ukrainians are very structured. They're very, very, very targeted about what they're doing. And the reason for that is because they're digitalized, because they know what's going on in the field. And the Russians are still using paper maps. So there's a whole different kind of warfare that's happening. But yeah, to your point, there are good things, there are bad things, but I think we have to divide what's good, what's bad, and what essentially we can live with. Because it's not really about the Ukrainians. I don't criticize the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have the right to self-defense, right? They have to do everything they can to push the Russians out. But it's more about our perspective. It's like, can we replicate what the Ukrainians do? If not, why not? And if we cannot, why aren't we speaking out? If we can, like, what are we going to replicate? How are we going to do that, right? What kind of talent do we need? What kind of companies do we need? Do we need companies like Clearview to actually operate within our borders so that we can use them, right? That's the question. Maybe the question is yes. And there's to restructure a whole normative discussion, but we have to have this discussion. But until then, we cannot divide into good and bad.
If I'm a Danish company or a Danish IT professional, and I want to help Ukraine, I want Ukraine to win this war. I hear you say that it's working. So, and I want to contribute to the IT army.
Yeah.
What do I need to consider?
If you're a Danish company and want to contribute, I think you can do that. A lot of companies are doing it. Recorded Future, for example, Yubico is working on sending YubiKeys over. There's a lot of cooperation, but you have to know who you're cooperating with and what the problems are that might result if you cooperating with certain players that are not really honest to you, are misusing your products maybe, because like Fedorov even came out with this publicly. They said, we want to win this war, and if we have to lie, it doesn't matter, right? We lie to you just to win this war. That's essentially the Ukrainian position currently. And so I think for companies and individuals, it's really important to figure out, like, what are you comfortable with? Where are your own moral and ethical values? Like some companies cannot police what their employees are doing. It simply doesn't work. Like you go home after work and you just switch on your computer at home and you work for the IT Army, right? So, for example, there was Huub Mollekop, who's an investigative journalist at Dutch newspaper The Volkskrant, was able to interview a colonel, they call it, at the IT Army. So it's pretty high up, called Hactic. And sadly, this article has only been published in Dutch. But what Hactic essentially said is that there are 25 to 30 generals that manage the IT Army, and they hail from across the Ukraine government, including the Security Service and the Ministry of Defense, which essentially was in line with our findings. But what Hactic also said was that, essentially Huub Mollekop went to his home, and he is located in the Netherlands, right? So he does this from a NATO and EU country, right? And the tricky part is also that Hactic is a former Dutch Special Operations Officer, right? So there's a military component to this. And he's probably not the only former military intelligence officer or military operator whatsoever, right? So there are probably a lot more people from different parts of the world that are participating in this. And maybe they're Danish military officers who are participating in this. That brings a whole different dimension to this conflict, right? If you, from a Russian perspective, look at this, and they will be like, hey, NATO is participating in this, or the Danish government is supporting this, even though it isn't. But you really have to count on the ethical and moral values that each one of you has to consider what is right and wrong. Maybe supporting Ukraine in this context, joining the IT Army is the right thing to do according to your moral values. Then do it. But if you have doubts, don't do it. There might be consequences later on. People will find out who you are. Maybe the IT Army is not as secure or as they think they are. Maybe some stuff will leak, internal chats or whatever, and there might be repercussions down the line. Because European governments are kind of in the bind now. They have to figure this out. It's like what the IT Army does, what European citizens and NATO citizens are doing. Is it cybercrime? Is it essentially working for a foreign government? And who are these people, right? So how do we treat them? What kind of legal status do they have? Currently that's unresolved, but companies really need to think about what their employees are doing. And for example, the DDoS tool developers for the IT Army some of them work for Western companies and they do it openly. So you can go to their GitHub profile, they'll state, I work for this company, blah, blah, blah. And nobody at that company talks about this, maybe they don't know about it, but it's a problem. And yeah, I don't have a solution. But I'll only bring questions, I guess.
You mentioning questions leads me to where we are almost out of time, but I feel like in the title for this presentation you teased some like uncomfortable questions. So I guess if we can end on you maybe summing up like this conversation about what use cases for consumer grade mostly technology we accept and which we won't.
Yeah.
What are the uncomfortable questions that raises, and who needs to have that conversation?
I think the most uncomfortable question, particularly for the IT sector, is that companies nowadays have to think about international law. They have to think about geopolitics in a very meaningful way, and not like it's just export restriction and so on. It's like business legal stuff and so on. No, you have to think about international law. You think about international humanitarian law. You have to know what your product is being used for. Is it being misused? How do you control your products that they're not being misused? I think those are the huge questions that a lot of companies will have to face, whether it's Cisco, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's anybody who's here, where the products are going. And you don't have that expertise in-house, I can tell. I've been to Microsoft, I've talked to the guys, and they're like, you essentially talk to a lawyer that has no clue about international law. They have clue about business stuff. You talk about, like, when I approach them, the PR team, they sent to me the PR team. I'm like, I don't want to talk to you guys. You have no clue what you're doing, right? But then you have Brett Smith out there and saying, we're involved in the geopolitical war, we're trying to protect you against cyber war and so on. But it's super difficult for every other company to do that, right? To be engaged in those discussions. They're happening on the UN level, they're happening domestically, they're happening with the armed forces in terms of what the armed forces are allowed to do legally and so forth. So I think private companies will have a reckoning in the months and years ahead that you will be faced with a problem that you never thought about you needed any capacity in-house to deal with this. So that's a really uncomfortable question in the sector because, again, those are resources that you have to expedite, and you might be sued. You might have massive lawsuits that are coming your way. You might be sued by another government and called out that way. And you might be sued by your own government. And you have no clue why you're sued because of software is used by somebody else across the globe. But that will likely happen. And you need to prepare for that. And good luck.
Let's leave it at that. Please give Stefan a round of applause.
Download this report. It's very easy to find. You just go in Google, type IT Army or IT Army of Ukraine. This will be the first and second